If you've seen the unboxing of this kit, I went into details about the body and some specific panel lines that weren't really right. Some on the side are really wavy and not really looking the way they should, so I need to correct that and make them back straight again. Now I'm not going to do this with a Panelline scriber, as that will just follow the lines of the waves and make it even worse. Instead, I'm using a saw blade from Skill Motorsports, which saws right through them in a straight line, following the Panelline a bit better than it would have done with the Panelline scriber. So I'm carefully doing it section by section, one piece at a time, until I'm happy and have a nice straight Panelline without the waviness in it, as you can see here. Along with the waviness, it's also a bit of a bubble, a bit of a buildup of some resin that is inside of the panel line somehow, so I need to saw through it in the straight line and also go down again to make the panel line nice and deep, all even over the entire panel line. This of course was done to both sides, and I could then move on to all the other panel lines, just making them a bit deeper. Some others that weren't really visible will be tackled later on. Most of the panel lines have now been taken care of. Some were actually pretty much missing. There was a small indent, but not really enough to make it a nice scribable panel line without ruining it and going all over the place. So I put down a piece of tape along that panel line. It's nice and straight now, then cut into it with a hobby knife a couple of times to start the panel line, and then start scribing it out with the saw blade you saw me use earlier. And then I'm going to move on to finishing it off with the engraving blade. The panel lines are now all fixed, nice and deep and ready for paint, but before I could do that, I of course need to scuff up the entire body with some 600 grit first. During the sanding, I noticed a small bubble on the side of the door which needs to be fixed, so I'm coloring it in with a permanent marker to show me a sort of guide coat onto where it is and in what stage it is from the removal process, and then start to carefully remove it with the sanding sponge first, which didn't really work. It was kind of still there, and then I moved on to a sanding stick which entirely removed it. It's a bit rougher, so afterwards I needed to sand it back down with the sanding sponge to remove those rougher scratches and get it ready for primer. With that all done, the body is now ready for primer. Now I'm using some gray primer from Zero Paints. This actually is not the right primer for a resin. Now it is a primer that I had, and I've used it in the past on a couple of these other builds as well. It works pretty well, but it doesn't really stick all the way down as it should. So instead of this primer, I advise to use some Tamiya gray primer, which I will be using on the next project. But for now, this will do. It worked fine, as I didn't really need to mask off anything on the body, and therefore it could be used just as well. 3 nice thick coats of primer later, I let it sit and dry for about 15 minutes and then started sanding it down smooth again with some 3000 grit sanding sponges in order to remove any dust, any uneven spots or rough spots in the primer and make it as smooth as it possibly can be for the paint to lay down as best as it can. Now, like I said before, the primer I'm using isn't really correct for resin, so I'm doing this now instead of after I have painted it, because now if I just pull up some primer, I can sand it down back easily and just spray a couple more coats of primer. If I do this with paint, it will be a lot more work. So I'm laying down a piece of tape and marking it out with a marker to make a template for the carbon fiber decals that I will be applying to these side skirts later on. With that all said and done, I could move on to going over these hard to reach, easy to forget spots first, and then giving the rest of the body a nice light coat as well. After finishing up the first coat, I let it sit and dry for about 5 minutes in between and then moved on to the second coat and added a couple more after. The final coat of color went on nice and smooth, is even all over, so I could let it sit and cure for about 30 minutes before I moved on to adding some color to the side mirrors. There is a black piece on the bottom that holds the mirrors to the body. I could have masked it off really carefully and then painted it with the airbrush, or instead just use some acrylic paint, do it by hand and clear coat it afterward. As that doesn't really matter, the brush strokes will pretty much disappear with the clear coat on and you wouldn't be able to tell. It's a lot easier, a lot quicker, and I think a lot nicer way of doing it instead of just taking a lot of time in masking it off and perfectly ruining it probably. So this is the way I prefer it. It's a nice little trick that can be done. I do advise to only do this with acrylic paints. All the other paints could react to the clear coat. As you'd seen me done earlier, I moved on to making a couple of templates for the side and also on the rear, transferred that to the carbon fiber decals from Scale Production, cut those out and put them in place, forming them with some decal setting solution and also some decal softening solution, carefully taking my time. I have multiple videos on my channel about this, so if you want to know more about applying the decals and forming them, feel free to check out my channel. Some other decals on the side and on the hood were placed as well. I let that cure for a bit and then started moving on to the clear coat. Recently, I've been getting a lot of questions about getting a dust-free paint job. Well, pretty much, in my opinion, it is impossible. But the best way I have found to prevent as much dust as possible is to be in a dust-free environment, don't really wear any dusty clothing, and of course use a spray booth. Before I apply any color or clear coat, I go over the entire body with just some air blowing through the airbrush and removing all of that dust that is on it. And that helps a lot in removing most of the dust. It won't do all of it. Even this paint job has a couple of small dust spots in it, but I don't really mind as they aren't really that visible. The first coat of clear is going on nicely, and I'm letting it sit and dry for about 5 minutes before moving on to doing the same on the second coat. I applied the first 3 coats of clear pretty lightly, letting them sit and dry for about 5 minutes in between, and for the fourth and final coat I went a bit thicker, and I also reduced the clear coat a bit more, about 10% extra thinners, to get it nice and thin and have it flow out over the entire body. If the clear coat is really thick, it doesn't really want to flow, but with the first 3 coats and a thicker clear coat mixture on, the clear coat is on the body already, so this final coat can have it flow out nice and even, so a bit extra thinner doesn't really hurt all that much.